Hi, everyone. Let's settle in. We're going to start the next session. My name is Rodan Zadeh. On behalf of MIT Sloan CIO Symposium, I welcome you to our next session. It is a great pleasure to introduce Ryan Mallory from Equinix to the symposium. But before we get started and before I introduce him, just a bit of housekeeping. We know this is a lunch hour session. We appreciate if you could keep the noise to minimum, turning off your cell phones. Having conversation with your neighbors is fine, as long as if it's funny and you're laughing, please share the joke with everyone else. If you are looking for restrooms, they are outside this door to your right and then to your left, straight ahead. In case of emergency, there will be oxygen masks dropping from the ceiling. Please put the mask on yourselves first before you put it on a politician. Okay, now that we got all the housekeeping stuff off the table, did you guys enjoy the morning sessions? Anything interesting you learned? Good, good. So I attended some sessions, and we heard a lot about cloud. We heard a lot about transformation. And as we were putting together this session, one of the things we wanted to highlight is really when we talk about cloud, what do we mean? What does it take to transition to the new systems in the cloud? And what are the different components you want to keep in mind? So it's a great pleasure to introduce Ryan, but also Equinix to this session, because they really know a lot about the cloud. As a matter of fact, for those of us who live on the East Coast, Equinix is not a gym where you walk in and there's a cloud of adrenaline. Speaking of cloud, they're a data center provider, and I'll let Ryan introduce the company to you. But they really have a claim to being able to talk about cloud. 93%, I was really amazed to hear this. 93% of the internet traffic goes through their networks. So these guys know a thing or two about cloud. And by the way, whenever I think of cloud, I think of mountains, Rocky Mountains, as in Colorado. And Ryan is from Denver area, and because they're mile high up, he has his head in the cloud, so he could really tell us all about the cloud. I introduce Ryan.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. We're going to dive into and talk about some of the transformations that are taking place out in the market today. I know in some of the sessions there were conversations about cloud deployments, transformation, innovation. We're really going to jump into that now. I'm going to take 1 second and make sure everybody understands who Equinix is. Not a big sales pitch here, but it's very important to understand who Equinix is, so there's some credibility around why we feel that we're able to talk at this level. So we sit in a very privileged position based on the fact that the company was formed in 1998 to provide what in essence turned out to be May East and May West in the United States. So the peering infrastructure in the US to move it from carrier-based services into carrier-neutral environments. And so 20 years ago, we started down this process that was focused on networking, and this was the beginning of the public internets, the peering infrastructure that was out there. And so that was the first phase of the overall migration or the transitions that we started to see. This is where you had the tier 1 network providers coming together and starting to do peering amongst themselves in the creation of the internet. The second phase was around content delivery providers coming to market and then being able to start offering their services. So the distribution of capabilities of applications and this electronic environment that people could use to actually transact. This spawned the third level of evolution, which was the ecosystem development. And this was really focused around what we saw is the connection of of whole business units or verticals out in the marketplace. And a primary transaction point that we saw starting to happen here was about the financial institutions. And so we started to see very key ecosystems beginning to develop in New York, Chicago, Hong Kong, Tokyo, and London around the financial trading environments. And so this whole progression started to really develop. About 5 years ago, we saw another ecosystem or another networking development starting to transpire around clouds. And so since then, we've seen a rapid compression of the next evolution. And this is this highly interconnected enterprise, or the Internet of Things that's out there, communicating with each other all the time. And so as you start to think about these progressions, this is over the last 20, 25 years, we continue to see the developments from a timeline compress. So you have to be ready to transition into that next area. So you always want to skate to where the puck is going, not rely on where it's at today. When you start to think about the drivers associated with what these changes are starting to happen, you're seeing a top-down push from commerce and collaboration. So if you start to look at some of these numbers and the B2B, B2C transaction levels that you're having, as well as some of the social media interactions, these are staggering. These are areas where 10 or 15 years ago, people were trying to worry if H323 was actually going to be a compatible video conferencing service that you could get distributed in enough locations. Now you have 1.6 billion hours of Skype sessions taking place. I mean, look at the number of transactions that you're starting to have take place from the digital advertising. These are market trends that are fundamentally driving how the interconnected environments out there today are developing. On the bottom side, you have the connectivity and the data models. So these are the influencers that are allowing these connectivity models on the top, or these commerce models on the top, to exist. When you start to look at the number of app sessions that are developed, we're in the trillions. When you look at the way companies are starting to think and feel about hybrid cloud, 5 years ago, the only cloud provider out there was really a bookstore. We're at a point now where 50% of the enterprises out in the market today have a hybrid cloud strategy. They may not have that all implemented. That's what we're going to dive into here. But there is a massive transformation taking place. If you're not aware of it, if you're not in front of it, you're going to be left behind. Some companies that have addressed this and embraced this are up here on the board. One of the key companies that we do a ton of business with is General Electric. And so 100 years ago, they were a hard goods provider. They sold washing machines, they sold light bulbs, they sold toasters. They're no longer a hard goods provider. They're a services provider. Their overall business strategy is around providing services that you can utilize that give you predictive analytics, so you understand when that light bulb is going to go out, when that refrigerator is going to go down, and what type of issues that you're having. One of the key use cases that we've developed with General Electric is around their jet engine business unit. And so their overall goal is to reduce the overall spend associated with one of their service entities by 1%. So when you purchase a jet engine, it's no longer strapped on the plane, out the door, call us when there's an issue. It's now every single flight that takes off, there's multiple terabits of data that's connected. What is the turbine speed? What is the wind shear? What was the temperature? How often were you able to reduce the RPMs to get more effective? Every time it lands, it then connects. All that information's loaded up into one of their data lakes. The analytics are then processed. They're working with the airlines to start to drive down the overall cost associated with fuel, etc. This is a fundamental change that's taken place over the last 10 years from GE moving from hard goods to a services and a software company. The second one I want to touch on is Nike. They're no longer just a footwear and apparel company. They now have sensors in all of their shoes that connect to your Fitbit, that connect to your smartwatch, that you can now track what your runs are. You're able to identify other people in the environment that you're working out with and have collaboration. You get together and you can run. So this is the true new interconnected world. And the last one I want to talk about is the connected car. Tesla was the innovator here and started putting out, the sonar-based services in their car. It's great and it's working fine, but the next evolution that we're seeing is fundamentally different. It's not just about, what that car can do today. There's going to be thousands of sensors in your vehicle that's not only helping you drive in a more safe fashion, but it's helping the environment become more aware of what's going on. Take this to another concept. Instead of uplinking your internet connection inside your car to a cell phone tower or Wi-Fi, imagine if it was built in the road 2 feet away. Imagine the connectivity levels that you could get between your car, the type of data analytics that could come up. Take this a step further. What if the road and the car actually were able to generate energy based on the connectivity between the car and the road surface? These aren't fiction. These are taking place today. There's a firm here in the Boston area that we work very closely with that is building smart cities that have all these type of components in there. The need to have salt on roads is a major impact to the environment. What if that car that was touching the road that was creating the energy was also able to heat the road so you never had to put salt down again? These are the concepts that are out there that this highly interconnected world that we're dealing with is helping to drive. I wanted to shape the landscape so everybody understood what's going on out there, kind of who we are, why I feel we sit in a very privileged position. I'm going to dive into this a little deeper now and start to talk about the frameworks you should be considering when you start to develop these type of models. We're seeing a massive transition happening inside the IT infrastructure. We've seen 3 tiers. Much like that first slide, when we looked at the evolution from a networking perspective, you need to think of evolution from an IT perspective. So when we started having the networks come together and start to form, this was the era of computing. This is when you had a static connection sitting on a LAN. It was trying to access some type of mainframe server and deliver a very static type of data flow back and forth. Zero network connections. This is what we saw starting to transpire in the 70s and 80s when the environment was starting to be created. In the internet era, when this was starting to come about, we started to see the networking models coming to be. It's very important to understand that this is the progression when you went from a one-to-one to one-to-many type of environment. You have billions of network connections. This is where you start to get true data gravity. This is where information starts to become relevant. This is the development where we're at today from a digital platform. You have a quadrillion of connections out there based on just the sheer number of applications that individuals are using and relying on proximity back and forth to each other. Every single person here has a smartphone. On that smartphone, there's probably at least a dozen apps. Of those dozen apps, there's probably some type of proximity service. You've got Lyft, you've got Uber, you've got Google Maps, something that's giving you an awareness connection. That's what's driving this next paradigm shift that's out in the marketplace. You have to start thinking about not what you're trying to do with your business today, whether it's an enterprise or a carrier trying to sell something, but what are you going to do to future-proof yourself? And it's not in 5 years, it's in 12 months. The marketplace is changing that fast. The static connectivity that we all cut our teeth in the networking and the deployment and the hardware world has fundamentally changed. You don't access a single type of service from an end office now. You don't build a static connection anywhere anymore if you're truly going to try to optimize services and have a good user experience. You have to embrace the digital environment, the digital ecosystem, and be aware of what the data fabric is that's out there. What are you trying to connect to? What are you trying to access? Where are your people? What type of services do you want to have in place? The digital engagement of the digital ecosystem is what you have to plan for today. What's driving this shift is the complete architecture that we were all familiar with fundamentally changing. So the core used to be the lion's share of the deployment model. The edge was very narrow for aggregation. That's since shifted in the last 3 to 5 years. The edge is where all the intelligence is. That's where all the edge caching is. That's where your storage and network aggregation resides. Your core has become so efficient and effective that your optics, your routing, and your switching is narrowed down. The type of capacity you can send across the core network now doesn't have to be this big deployment model. You have to plan for what type of applications you're going to put at the edge. You have to understand what type of network connectivity needs to be brought in. You need to understand your security profiles. That's what your edge architecture has to be comprised of, and that's where your deployment models may have been one rack, half a rack, quarter rack, may have been just a router at the edge. That's where you're putting your intelligent storage. That's where your AI is happening. And those where the type of services that we're seeing from a software-defined networking, software-defined power, software-defined architecture, all happening at the edge now. What's driving this is the ability to move from a highly meshed infrastructure, like you see in the middle and the top. This is what a legacy MPLS network looked like. Highly meshed. Every time a new site came on, it was in by provisioning to the other locations inside your WAN. Okay, that became very cost prohibitive. You started to see throughput speeds become diminished. You weren't able to actually move data files that were growing at a specific rate in a manner that was effective to your business. As soon as you start to send hard drives from site to site, you knew you had a network issue. You've got to start thinking about network transformation at the core to make sure you understand how you can be effective in deployment models in today's evolving architectures. That's where the bottom design here starts to take into account how you're going to optimize in highly connected interconnection facilities where have type 1, tier 1 services from networks, from clouds, from SaaS, from PaaS providers. This allows you to start moving into the virtual CIO realm where you can take everything that you are hosting in centralized locations, start to put closer to where people want to actually use them and consume them, so you don't have issues with VDI. You no longer have productivity every time you try to do a video conference and it drops. Nobody's waiting for batch files to load for hours or days. You have them close at hand. You understand who's going to access what, where, and why, and that really starts to move you into this hybrid deployment. Don't think about, I've got to be this provider versus that provider. The days of single sourcing are absolutely over. We look at this from the standpoint of being an interconnection provider who partners with everybody. We want to make sure that there's every option available, that the people we do business receive the greatest return on their investment by entering into our facilities. So the thing to start thinking about here is, what does your deployment really need to look like? Don't get sold on a single network provider. Don't get sold on a single cloud. Don't get sold on a single SaaS provider. Start thinking about what you need where and why. And that's what we're going to touch on here, going into some of the framework capabilities of being able to execute on this. And so when you start talking about global scale, hybrid models, being able to optimize performance, you've got to start thinking about repeatability and scale. It doesn't matter if you're a small shop in the central US trying to figure out how you need to expand to a second market. This concept will work. It doesn't matter if you're a Fortune 500 company. This concept will work. We've developed this so it is highly repeatable, so you can utilize this, and it's a concept that works not only in the US but around the globe. Everything starts with a core platform. And in that platform, you've got to have an ecosystem, and what we've seen start to develop is buyers and sellers. And so, the early progression that I referred to of developing that network, developing that content delivery, developing that ecosystem model, that's where we're at today. So we started 3 years ago launching a cloud exchange, and it was simply to allow IaaS providers to come in and connect to the network providers that had all the enterprises. And so this was meant to be, access to private connectivity, access to IaaS SaaS from the networks. And so that's what we were deemed as the service provider or sell side. But as soon as that became available, we saw this wave of enterprise customers coming in and saying, I want a higher level of intelligence. I want to be able to look, act, and feel like a type 1, tier 1 service provider or hyperscaler and be able to buy in this manner. So this is no longer just a sell side, buy side relationship. we have the largest hyperscalers now buying services from enterprise providers. We now have enterprise providers that were typically buyers selling services not only to peer-based companies, but also to large-scale hyperscale providers as well. This ecosystem effect at the platform, the buy-sell side, helps to drive the overall adoption models that we're going to touch into here in a second. Everything is focused around interconnection. What drives this relationship? Physical and logical interconnection. What was driving that edge and core modeling change? The ability to interconnect with networks, the ability to interconnect with buy-side customers, the ability to interconnect with different service providers that are out there. At Equinix, we view that our privileged position is all around interconnection. And we view that from our viewpoint, we want everything to be launched and enabled with the opportunity to connect to whoever you want to. So interconnection is the physical, logical access to whatever type of service you want from a network provider, a cloud provider, an enterprise provider. Being able to access that is important. And so that's really at the core from an interconnection standpoint of where we're at, where we're going, and what we want to talk about. Our viewpoint from interconnection focuses on an offering called interconnection-oriented architecture. So this takes the models that you've had out there and you're starting to look at from a CIO, a CISO, or a network engineering perspective and saying, okay, this is what I need to do. I need to have it in-house, bare metal, or I need to start to dabble in the cloud a little bit and start to develop these capabilities that all of my employees or all of my customers or all of my stakeholders need to have access to. So these are all symbols up here that everybody's familiar with, the AWS, the Box, the Microsoft, et cetera. Trying to bring those into your facilities, trying to buy licenses and try to manage those are the days of old. What you need to start thinking about is how do you provide access so your employees have better productivity, so you have shorter barriers to market for launching, so your financial barrier to entry into new markets becomes less significant. And that's where taking a repeatable, scalable model around the interconnected oriented architecture is essential. There's 4 key components to the framework of IOA that can be used for any type of deployment that you're looking at. I've had conversations here with several people. They're talking about, listen, I'm trying to do a global deployment. I need to make sure apps are closer to end users so I have performance that works better. Great, we can put it in this model. Network providers, hey, I'm trying to penetrate a new market. I'm not sure what the wireless demand is going to be there. That's great. Let's start to talk about some of these components as well. 4 key areas. We call it PLCD, people, locations, clouds, and data. Your user demographics are essential. So trying to build an overall structured model that has everything centralized in a specific area, I don't care if it's in the Americas, if it's in Europe, or if it's in Asia, does not work. Your workforce is mobile, your user base is mobile, your customers are mobile. You need to understand what that user base looks like, where they're going to be, how they want to access your services. This starts to drive then the overall location profile. Having this highly distributed mesh network isn't the way you can have effective service capabilities that are launched out there. Your cost structures and the implications associated with that can become crippling. I'll talk about a use case here in a couple slides that demonstrates that. You've got to understand where your services need to be distributed. There is no vanilla flavor anymore. You have to be comfortable with looking at each individual deployment as a unique edge node and help to model that. Your cloud infrastructure, what do you need? Do you need public? Do you need private? Do you know? And it's okay if you say yes to all 3. It's okay if you say, we don't even have a strategy yet. That's okay. That's what this infrastructure framework starts to allow you to put together. You're starting down there by simply asking any of those 3 questions, yes or no. And then lastly, what are your data sets? What do you need to have available to who and where? If you know, that's great. If you understand how those flows are taking place, Do you know the pinch points associated with it? So this model we've put in place with hundreds, if not thousands, of customers out there, both on the buy side and the sell side. We've also seen pretty significant analyst support of the models that we're talking about. They look at this slightly different from the overall aspect associated with what they deem success. You know, increase in bandwidth can be allocated to productivity and services. Reduction in OpEx costs allows you to start being able to fund more locations. You're buying where services are available. Reduction in latency, that's also a productivity matrix, et cetera, et cetera. So these are just validation points that you should consider. More importantly, I'm going to show you a use case here in a couple slides for a customer of ours that it just fundamentally changed the way they were able to operate their business. Taking that PLCD, the People Locations Cloud data concept, down one level. So start to think of this. This is an execution funnel moving from very wide and rangy in, hey, listen, what do I need to do? How do I need to make sure that I'm planning for the future? Taking it down to the next level from execution components associated with that framework. The first one around physics, this is latency. You have to understand what applications are where, and you have to be able to service them with the right level of connectivity. Just going out and buying vanilla services, it's just not going to work. The application growth and data set size continues to increase. We're seeing on average 100% data growth year over year, which also equates to 100% bandwidth growth year over year. That's where you've got to start planning for what and how you're going to deploy these type of capabilities. Physics matters. For most people, this is simply latency. You can't have a VDI application outside the acceptable range if you're going to have your employees use this. The first time they show up at a sales meeting or a conference and try to pull it up and it doesn't work, they're done. And they've lost confidence in that overall architecture. So you have to understand and start to plan for the physics or the latency as it relates to the different locations that your employees are going to operate out of. The next area is around volumes. What type of data sets are you going to push where, and how are you going to access this? This is where you're starting to pull in the concepts of PLCD into your deployment model, and you start to put more structure around what are we trying to do, where are we trying to do it, how are we trying to do it. This becomes essential when you're trying to operate AI type services, if you're starting to do any type of analytics. We're going to touch on workloads next, but this is where you start to narrow down that funnel, and it becomes very specific to understand this framework as it becomes more defined. The regulatory aspect of this is something that we don't cover in the high-level framework from an individual silo that you have to access. But this third tier in the overall funnel from a decision-making standpoint is essential. You've got to understand what your security domain is. How is it segmented? You have to have a security domain. There's a lot of different points of thought out there. You must understand what security is going to do for your organization, how you're going to separate your overall security vector. I was here last year talking about IoT services, had some conversation with some individuals about, are you going to trust the provider to actually deploy your IoT instance? We saw one of the largest DDoS attacks this year happen through IoT-based cameras. One of the largest retail breaches that we saw happened through an HVAC unit that was hacked. So those type of concepts have to be taken into account. That's why we've started to put this in here as a third component in this overall decision tree as you're starting to narrow this down. Security is essential. Understand your domain. Understand if you need to have a domain. Understand what you need to segment that domain to be. The bottom end of this decision tree, or this funnel that we're thinking about, is all around the workloads. So we've shaped the overall architecture. We're starting to talk about deployment models. Now we want to get highly focused on what does that workload demographic, or what does that workload type need to look like. There's 4 key components here: the collaboration, the contents, the analytics, and the ecosystem. These workloads start to move, and they build from a level of complexity, they build from a level of usability, and they build from a level of the infrastructure needed to support them. Collaboration, video conferencing, I've talked about that a little bit already. This is the one-to-one type communication, high bandwidth, but fairly predictable. You know where the endpoint should be. You know how that's going to operate. You can have this in cloud-based, or you can have it deployed in one of your edge nodes. The second area is around content delivery. Becomes much more widely distributed. This area of service and workload starts to become more ubiquitous out in the marketplace, but you also need to start planning and trending from a networks perspective. The analytics side is where you start to see a much higher volume of transaction at a larger level. So aggregation points out in the market, if you start to think about IoT aggregation in subcells or microcells or edge data centers, they're coming together, analytics are happening there, then they're pushing that to the next tier inside the overall architecture from an analytics AI type model. And then lastly, the ecosystem aspect. This is where applications are highly chatty. The communication systems have to be available all the time, always on, always communicating, always available. These are where your services start to become highly entwined with not only what your business units are doing, what your customers' businesses are doing, but also the upstream models as well. So workload demographics or workload trends that you need to start thinking about at the bottom end of this funnel when you start to think about how am I going to plan for the transition out in the marketplace today, whether it's for my own infrastructure, whether it's for my customer's infrastructure that I need to interact with, or whether it's for some type of acquisition we want to make out in the business environment. So a lot of data there that we just walked through in terms of how to make this decision tree effective. We essentially call this, the subway map for success. And so it was built on that same type of concept as you're trying to go from point A to point Z across an overall journey. Key concepts associated here: network, security, data, applications. This is a progression or a waterfall of blueprints that allow you to take into not only best practices that we've seen, but best practices our customers have seen and best practices analysts have seen, and it's made available out to the public on an open share type site. So we can give you guys the website that all this is hosted on. This isn't Equinix proprietary. It's open source information that we want to share with everybody so you understand this progression. Network, like I said, is at the core of everything. If you don't have a network transformation strategy based on where your networks are at today, where they need to be in 1 year, and where they need to be in 3, you're probably behind the curve because you're not optimizing service capabilities that are out there today that allow you to buy more effectively, that allow you to plan more effectively, but also allow you to support the other areas in the waterfall. Each one of these dots represents a blueprint that you can open up, and it just shows you, hey, these are best practices that we've seen. And so you can progress dot by dot in this overall work, in the overall knowledge base that we have, or you can skip around as you want. Once the networking blueprints have been defined or your network transformation has been complete and you've started down this high capacity type 1 architecture, you move into security. So making sure, like I said before, making sure your security domain is appropriately defined. Make sure you have the right type of infrastructure in place at the edge, whether it's hardware-based, whether it's virtual, and the type of segmentation that you need, all essential. Moving across these individual security workbooks allow you to help define that and understand what are other people out in the industry thinking about. And this changes so rapidly in terms of the attacks and the different types of vulnerabilities that are out there. Utilizing this, and we update these all the time, these are living, breathing documents, just gives you a reference point. Moving to the data blueprints, this is understanding what type of information you have where and how do you want to use it. Data at rest is nothing but storage. Data plus data can be acted on, and therefore you can make decisions. If you don't understand how to access your data and how to act on it, like I said, all you're doing is spending CapEx on storage. The information is power. Information has to be analyzed and acted on for it to be of any value to your internal business or external business. And then your application blueprint, start understanding and start thinking about what your application profile is, what it should look like, but more importantly, what is your DR strategy for applications? Not all applications are created equal. You have certain applications that are absolutely core to driving your business. You have some that are just nice to have. Do you understand what's cloud ready and what's not? When we go out and talk to customers, and whether it's from the buy side or the sell side, it's always, got to have a cloud strategy. I've got a cloud strategy, or I'm building one. Everything's going in the cloud. Okay, have you analyzed your applications? How many are cloud ready? Well, no, we're going to do that. Well, typically, you've got about 20% of your overall application profile that's cloud ready. Do you have the know-how to actually start that migration? Do you understand the governance associated with that? Are you capable of being able to see this from start to finish? It's not simple, but it's not hard if you follow a blueprint. So what I really wanted to make sure everybody was aware of is that there is a very defined process for the interconnected oriented architecture out there in the market today. We've got a roadmap to success that you can operate and use to build migration plans. You can look at them to help rationalize what you have in place today. But more importantly, you can just look at lessons learned that companies have that have posted that have done it yourself or done it themselves already. I'm going to take this back up a few levels to make sure we understand what is the tangible item that's being deployed in this interconnected oriented architecture. So we've talked about frameworks, we've talked about concepts, we've talked about what you need to think about when you start to deploy this overall transformation at the edge. It's an edge node. In our world, it's a physical cabinet. You want to deploy a cabinet in an interconnected environment that allows you to connect to the network providers you want, the cloud providers you want, and the associated business partners that you need to connect to. It's that simple. We start with an edge node in very strategic locations, and that's where we start to build the PLCD model around. A mesh of nodes can be domestic, it can be in the same market, it can be around the globe. We sit in a very privileged position to have greater than 175 data centers around the globe in virtually every significant interconnection point that's available. And that's why when we start looking at this overall architecture, that's where we've come to this understanding that if you understand these 4 points from the framework, you're able to distribute your network in a manner that becomes highly effective, not only for you from a cost perspective, but from your end users from a customer experience perspective. And the last point I want to touch on here is really that don't get hung up that everything is cookie cutter. We try to drive repeatability in the concept. There's never repeatability from an offer standpoint. What you deploy in one location probably won't look the same as what you're going to deploy in another location. We've looked at this from an analytics perspective based on the number of individuals in a specific market to bandwidth to how big the office is, how long the lease is, you name it, we've looked at it. There's no consistency. You have to sit down and you have to start talking. What type of apps are they using there? That will determine what type of routing or switching infrastructure, because it's going to be influenced by the network. What type of security policy is this? Is this a branch office that may be run by some type of franchisor that isn't part of the core? You don't know. That's why when you think about this framework, don't get hung up that, oh man, I've got to start looking at edge nodes in 175 locations. You don't. There are a handful of them out there. The aggregation points where your customers sit are where important, or what's important. This is the way we represent what that edge node looks like. And so we started this concept about 6 years ago with a primary use case from a large soda company that just wanted to figure out how they could make their WebEx work. So their productivity levels had dropped so significantly because everything around the globe was being homed back to Cincinnati, Ohio, that they couldn't figure out how just to make their WebEx services work. So that's when we started down this concept of putting these edge aggregation or edge nodes from a communication and an exchange perspective out in the marketplace. This gives you the fundamental ability to aggregate any type of network service. We've got greater than 1,500 network service providers that sit inside our facilities. So every major packet exchange from the wireless standpoint, microwave services, point-to-point fiber networks, Ethernet, public internet, this is your aggregation point. You now are able to buy Type 1, Tier 1 services the same way a Fortune 500 company can with the same type of leverage. When you have this type of marketplace, you have the ability not only to turn it up and purchase quicker, but we have the ability to deliver that service from a physical or logical cross-connect in 48 hours to virtual real-time. So if you have a node like this deployed in a marketplace and you know who your carriers are, you have the ability to provision services much more rapidly. The other aspect of this is understanding your virtualized service and capabilities out there. You're not running a physical cross-connect or trying to use the public internet to access your cloud providers. You're now doing this with a single port on a cloud exchange that allows you to build virtual circuits through a web-based interface to say, I need to have my ExpressRoute Azure instance brought up, and I'm using this for all my Microsoft-based applications. I'm also using AWS for some of their CDN-based services. As long as your application is built right, you could then migrate it over to GCI, the Google Cloud, to use their AI instance. You have the ability through software-defined capabilities to utilize the Exchange Fabric to access all of these different clouds that are terminated here. So this becomes very powerful when you start thinking about the original use case around IaaS. What's happened, though, is IaaS is becoming mature from a deployment model, but the enterprise said, we want more. We want to have more services and capabilities that are virtualized. The next thing that came was UC. I wish I could say, the team of architects that report to me had the foresight to drive this. It wasn't. It was the enterprise. They said, we want virtual PBX. We want UC in the cloud. And so instantly, those type of providers came, and we started to see that use case. The next was payments. The next was HR, CRM, ERP. I've seen some of the providers here that sit on the cloud exchange. You're able to access this with a virtual circuit that's brought up. You're now not worrying about, hey, what do I need to do for this new market I'm going into? I drop a cabinet, router and switch, and access into the different cloud providers. You have your HR services brought up. Okay, I now know how to pay people because that service is sitting in the cloud as well. You're not deploying a lot of infrastructure. You don't have extensive OpEx or CapEx costs until you see that market start to grow. This is the type of trend in the transition we're seeing in the evolution of a highly interconnected world. This is the use case I talked about. This is a customer of ours. It's called Rockwell Collins. They're a manufacturing construction company in the central US. So we were engaged with them, and we came in. They had 1,800 sites that were all on an MPLS mesh. And so their primary issue was around the ability to be able to move CAD files and some data sets between the different offices. A lot of them were either out in rural locations, or just the throughput they had on their MPLS mesh wasn't able to handle the data flows. So we took a step back. We started to look at this from the people, location, the clouds, and data, started to narrow the funnel down, and what we found is that in very key locations were the vast majority of their applications being distributed from. So we started to put in these edge nodes that allowed them to cache specific information or have access to cloud-based services that they could collaborate from or use as a means to interact with not only individuals inside their company, but also the partners associated with the services that were being provided. The next level was trying to make sure that their mobile workforce was enabled and drive better performance and cost effectiveness to help move their overall internal infrastructure into the cloud. Big driver here, cost reduction, 45%. That was just on their core network. So when we sat down and we looked at their entire network spend, we went through a network transformation. They were able to move from MPLS into high-speed Ethernet into the aggregation points that are highlighted up on the screen here, and able to increase the overall throughput so they could have those data sets now that were working. They weren't waiting a week or two for an actual single line drawing to get sent from the central US to Miami, and then that to be edited and sent back to the headquarters. They were doing it dynamically from a collaboration instance in the cloud. The big one for me is about the latency improvement. To me, that's an indicator around productivity. Most people, when they start down these type of evaluations or this transformation process, think it's about getting to the cloud or think it's about saving money. The way I like to look at it, it's all about productivity. If your employees have a better user experience, they're going to be happier, they're going to be more effective in their jobs. That's, from my standpoint, that drives success. That's not the success factor for everybody, but that's indicative. Latency, to me, equals productivity. Then the bandwidth increase, I touched on that. That was, the MPLS moving into Ethernet. And when you start looking at the scope here, 700%, they were basically able to bring their network up to par and then future-proof it for a couple years. Your networks, if you're in an industry like this, where the data sets get larger, they get more complex, you start looking not just at 2D, 3D, 4D, interactive rendering, your bandwidth requirements are going to go exponentially through the roof. In this type of industry, everything's moving to the HoloLens type interaction, where you're actually getting inside the diagram, not just looking at it or even looking at a digital rendering anymore. That's what you need to plan for from an overall bandwidth standpoint in order to stay ahead of the overall development curve that's out there. And then to wrap things up, there's some key components when you're thinking about these frameworks that you want to take into account that you need to make sure exist out in the environment that you're looking at. The ecosystem. Are the people present that you want to connect with? Make sure you understand who is truly local or is truly off-net that you want to connect to. That's the ecosystem effect. Everybody isn't everywhere, but there's the ability to get to whoever you want through the right type of deployment models. Global reach, make sure you understand where you need to go. If you're planning on new markets or you're looking at new types of scenarios, make sure your partner's enabled to be able to address that. And lastly, availability. Make sure that the SLAs that you're trying to drive are very distinct. Make sure you understand them. Make sure whoever you're partnering with is willing to pass them through. I made the comment before that there's no single source service out in the market today. That's absolutely true. Being able to manage your overall SLA profile is just as essential as understanding how to build your infrastructure. So these are some areas that you need to keep into account. Like I said, I feel we sit in a very privileged position based on the type of interconnection models that we see and interact with out there, based on our overall global deployment. That's why I wanted to share some of this transformation ideation that's taking place out there and how we're addressing it. And so I appreciate everybody's time. If people have questions, I'm more than happy to answer them here, or we can jump into a side conversation. So thanks very much.
We have another 10 minutes.
Okay.
We have another 10 minutes, so we have room for questions. Now, Randy and I, before you guys sat down, we put some special things under your seats. If you reach in, you might be the lucky one. I'm kidding. Any questions? I think this was very insightful, just to think about the infrastructure capability, but also think about the transformation from people's perspective. Mm-hmm. Bringing all those two things together, in my view, was fantastic.
Good.
Back to you.
Where's the presentation available?
Okay, so if you have the app called Slido, that's sli.do, you could actually get to the presentations there. But speaking of that, I know other sessions were using this app to collect questions. I didn't see any questions in the app for this session. So I think in the other sessions you'll be using it. So go ahead.
The slides aren't on Slido.
Okay.
Slides are not on Slido. Okay, we have a list of who attended this session, and we'll send it out to you.
And if anybody wants to give us like the business card, we'd be more happy to send out the presentation as well as the link to the roadmap for the infants for the IOA. Mm-hmm. So feel free to give it to me, get them at the door, Ryan Mallory, no problem.
Question. I'm on the slide, you put up availability and SLAs, and you talked about, the 4 nines, 99.99.
Yep.
So is there a big difference in cost structure and implementation structure if you go to 3 nines versus 4 nines versus 5 nines?
Sure. So the question was, is there a big cost structure differentiation between higher or lower level of reliability? You're going to pay, there's not going to be a high contractual value when you're trying to negotiate with somebody, because most people are going to represent the 5 nines type deployment, whether it's network or data center. You have to decide as an individual if you're able to if your business unit will be able to tolerate a certain level of downtime. And so, there's all types of metric calculations that are out there that says, if you're, 4 nines, this is how many minutes or hours per year you're down, et cetera, et cetera. Only you can determine that. We look at it from the standpoint of, the availability of the actual facility, and then we start to break it down from an SLA pass-through with managed service providers, et cetera, that sit inside the building. Yep. Any others?
Do you have any examples where this is being done in the healthcare setting?
In the healthcare, we have them in the pharmaceutical, and we have them in several enterprise companies that are associated with healthcare, but I can't name them by name. So a lot that deal with more of the type of Obamacare exchange type environment where they're deploying this from data aggregation type models. And Kaiser Permanente. Yep. Anything else? Great, guys. Appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you.